Hey everybody, Jeff Oriema here. My guest today is a notable open source maintainer, React expert, and sought after speaker in the software development community. We sat down to talk GraphQL, Apollo Client, and more. Here it goes. Well, we have with us today Lenz Weber-Tronic. Lenz, why don't you give us a quick intro?
Yeah, hi. I'm Lenz, nickname Frenius. You probably seen me on GitHub or like Blue Sky or something as Fry. I'm a maintainer of Apollo client. I work at Apollo for 3 years now, and I'm also maintaining a bunch of other open source stuff, not so actively currently on Redux Toolkit, but all over the place, smaller things, contributing to things, part of the open source ecosystem.
Apollo Client just reached version 4 not too long ago and is now just released 4.2, so we're already a few minor versions in. But what's a feature that's shipped recently that you really like?
We did something really wacky with TypeScript in 4.2, and I always like those things.
Is it
The,
Doom? Just checking.
it's not Doom.
Okay, Doom and Apollo
The,
Client, yeah.
it, the thing is, Apollo client has an option called default options, which means that you can, in a central place, define options that will be applied to every query, every subscription that's created. And those options can change the result of a type. So depending on the error policy, the return value of user spans query could be undefined, or it would always be defined. And in the past, we would honor those options on the hook level, but we were just not aware what was globally defined anywhere. It's pretty hard to do that. And that could lead to very wrong TypeScript code, people assuming they don't need a null check where they would actually need a null check and stuff like that. So we created like a global interface that you can extend with module augmentation, where you can define what your options are, like your global defaults. And one nice part of that is that the moment you start creating that interface and like adding options, you cannot create Apollo client anymore without specifying exactly those options. So it tells you need, if you create a new Apollo client instance, you need to pass exactly those options in that you declared for it, because otherwise your runtime code and your types will disagree. The other way around, if you don't declare those, you also can't create it because it says you don't have default options. You have to declare those on a TypeScript level first. And I think we got really nice error messages for that. The other thing is that generally, like through the bank, our hooks now support these global options and the options that are passed in. And even if you only stay with the options that are passed in, it's much more accurate to what's actually going to happen than what those hooks were before. The downside is that if that's all we did, if you installed Apollo Client 4.2 in an existing code base, you might be met with more accurate hooks, but probably a lot of error messages like in your TypeScript. So this would be a breaking change, and we can't really do that. So what we did here is that for every hook, the old classic TypeScript signature exists, and the new enhanced modern TypeScript signature exists now. And the moment you start defining these global options, it switches from the old options to the new options.
Huh.
And that way, existing projects don't get a problem. But if you opt into the new hooks, like there's also an option that you can just set if you don't have global options to opt into the global hook and into the modern hooks, you get all the super new types. And that's something that I haven't seen another library do, like ship 2 type definitions for every API that we have that behave completely differently, and you have a global switch to switch between them. So yeah, that's 4.0.
That's marvelous. That sounds great for users and a nightmare to maintain. So I'm glad the users are getting that.
We added, I think, 15 mock projects with different global augmentations within the repo, just as test suits to see which way types would go if we set one or another global option. So yes, it's a nightmare to maintain, but I'm really happy we got it to work.
Just doing the yeoman's work there. What's coming up next in your open source work?
Right now, I'm orienting myself a little bit. Cheryl is working on Apollo Client, adding scalar support. On the other hand, GraphQL 17 was just released, and that moves the whole ecosystem. And the whole ecosystem has to move for GraphQL 17 to be accepted. So the first thing that we did, which was like the easy thing, was the peer dependency in Apollo Client and related packages. Also the peer dependency in GraphQL tag. But then there's also that Apollo server, where not only the library is a peer dependency, but where we would actually have to adjust behavior. Because GraphQL 17 actually comes with a lot of new features. And of course, we want to support those. And then there's like another kind of wacky thing that I got on my list of things I want to try. And that is essentially a modified, like probably like a code modified version of GraphQL.js. The thing with GraphQL.js right now is completely synchronous and stuff like parsing, validation, etc. And that's something that we see with like Explorer and Sandbox, our Apollo Studio stuff, where if people write a lot of very complicated queries against extremely complicated schemas, the validation rules of GraphQL can take a very long time. And that's also something that would, for example, impact the VS Code extension. And the problem there is, A, it's synchronous and blocking, and some of those rules can be n-squared. So if you have a very complicated schema and you have a lot of stuff to put in there, typing can actually become slow. And it's not particularly our or anyone's fault, but there's something that probably needs to be done about that. And I want to apply a technique that's based a little bit on generators, like inspired by Redux Saga a little bit, where just work is split up into smaller chunks and can be paused and orchestrated from the outside instead of only being method calls from the inside. Where I want to change the way that GraphQL.js itself is called so I can schedule it. I can say, do 5 milliseconds of GraphQL work and then wait for the next, I don't know, request animation frame or something. And after that, do the next chunk. So your UI will never be blocking even if you have a really complicated validation going on in the background or like big schema to parse.
Would that be just going like root field by root field maybe, or like how would you chunk that out?
I would usually yield executions of sub-functions, have those invoked from the outside, and then maybe looking at the code base, there's like 3 or 4 loops that maybe also need a yield to just have an option to pause there. But apart from that, it would probably be a code model that just turns every function into a generator and has it orchestrated from the outside. Because that means I can on one hand schedule those functions and pause them very shortly from time to time. The other thing is that I could, of course, I create promises, but I could also abort validations. If the user types, you're not interested in the validation of the first thing the user typed or the middle thing the user typed, but you're interested in once the user stops actually the result. But you can't just do that with a synchronous 200 millisecond action and a debounce, because it just doesn't work like that. You really need that scheduling or the asynchronicity. And then there's another concept that Anthony Fu wrote a blog article about colored functions, where he describes that a function is either colored synchronous or asynchronous in JavaScript. And he describes multicolored functions. So a function that can be invoked synchronous or can be invoked asynchronous. And if you invoke synchronous, you're blocking. If you invoke it async, you get a promise. And the interesting thing is that he uses those to compose multiple functions that rely on each other. And if you call the root function in the whole function call synchronous, you have like just a normal synchronous function call. If you call the root function asynchronously, the whole thing all the way down is async. And if you combine those two things, like the Redux Saga orchestration and the async colored functions, you would get a really interesting version of the GraphQL library for the stuff that usually can block a long time. So that's on my list. I hope I get to it sometime soon.
That sounds cool. I would love to read that pull request.
I
I
fear
love
it's going to be a
generators.
fork. I don't think that will ever make it into the core, but if we get to the point where it's like a machine maintained fork, as the upstream version, I think we could get to that point, and it would be really interesting.
I am a huge fan of anything. I feel like I've used generators, but I always like reached for a use case just to have fun with them. And once made like a version of Game of Life that each tick of the game was captured in an iterator.
Yeah.
But I still felt like that probably wasn't necessary, but it was fun. This actually feels like a very idiomatic use of that convention. That sounds really interesting. Well, thank you, Lenz. This is really great. Thank you for sharing all your insights. Really appreciate it. Looking forward to all the things that are coming and grateful for all the work that you've put into the open source community.
Yeah. Thank you for having me.